Have you ever dreamed of becoming someone no longer shaken by rejection, no longer tortured by silence, no longer imprisoned by the fear of not being enough? You wouldn't be the only one, because somewhere inside you, maybe hidden beneath years of pretending to be okay, is a version of you that still aches, still waits, still bleeds quietly every time someone doesn't see you, value you, or love you the way you hoped they would. And it's exhausting, isn't it? The emotional tightrope, the smile that hides the storm, the constant calculation of who you're allowed to be depending on who's in the room. But let me ask you something most people never dare to ask. What if the reason you're still hurting isn't because the world is cruel, but because you've been taught to abandon yourself in the name of survival? Carl Jung said, "We are not what happens to us, but what we choose to become." But here's the truth most people run from. You can't become who you truly are if you're still performing for the approval of people who don't even see the real you. You can't become whole if you're still cutting off the parts of yourself that others once made you feel ashamed of. And you will never feel truly safe, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, until you confront the hidden belief that your worth is dependent on how others treat you. It's time to expose that lie, because as long as you keep trying to avoid pain, pain will control your life. And the longer you avoid facing your unconscious wounds, the more power you give them to shape your reality, your reactions, your identity. You think you're just sensitive. You think you're just bad at relationships. You think if you were just a little more confident, stronger, smarter, then maybe you'd stop feeling like this. Not the truth? None of that is the problem. The problem is that you're still fighting battles inside yourself you don't even remember signing up for. Old wounds, childhood patterns, psychological ghosts you've never met, but who still live rent-free in your nervous system. That's not weakness. That's unintegrated pain. Jung called this the unconscious, the part of you that runs the show when you're not looking. It's not passive, it's not neutral. It's the place where your past shapes your present, where unspoken trauma distorts your vision, where old stories keep writing new chapters, even when you swear you've moved on. And until you make that unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you'll call it fate. So if you're tired of being hurt, tired of breaking down behind closed doors, tired of acting strong when all you want is to feel safe, really safe, deep down, then hear this. You don't need to become tougher. You need to become whole, because real power doesn't come from building walls. It comes from tearing down the ones that keep you disconnected from your own soul. It comes from turning inward, into the places you've avoided, the truths you've buried, the parts of you you thought were too messy, too needy, too broken to be seen. It comes from integration, and integration is not about fixing yourself. It's about finally listening to yourself. Carl Jung believed that every emotional trigger, every painful reaction, every moment where your heart cracks open is a message, a map, a clue pointing you toward the deeper work that must be done. But most people never follow that map. They numb it, deny it, blame it on others. They say that person hurt me without asking what inside me responded to that hurt. And that's not your fault. You've been taught to fear your pain, taught to avoid, suppress, escape. But pain that is not faced does not disappear. It transforms into anxiety, into shame, into patterns of self-betrayal that feel like just the way I am. Let me tell you the brutal truth. You are not being hurt by other people. You are being hurt by what their behavior activates inside you. It's not what they did. It's the wound inside you that responded. And that wound, it's sacred. Not because it's good to suffer, but because that wound is a doorway. the passage into the parts of you you've never met, the vulnerable child, the silenced inner voice, the original self that existed before the world told you who to be. Until you confront that place, until you meet yourself there with raw honesty and unconditional presence, you will remain a hostage to every word, every silence, every rejection you receive. But here's what no one tells you. You can reclaim that power. You can become someone who is no longer shattered by absence, no longer defined by abandonment, no longer seeking love in places that only echo your own unhealed pain. You can become someone who listens to their wounds and responds not with fear, but with integration. That's the work Jung called shadow work. It's the process of reclaiming the parts of you that have been exiled, not just your darkness, but your light, your voice, your sensitivity, your emotional intensity, your sacred anger, your buried joy. And when you begin to bring those pieces back, when you stop apologizing for your existence and start honoring the truth of who you are, something radical happens. You stop trying to get love from the world, and you become the source of your own safety. You stop living to be chosen, and you choose yourself. Not in a surface-level Instagram quote kind of way, but in the kind of way that rewires your nervous system, that transforms your relationships, that makes you unshakable, not because nothing affects you, but because you are no longer afraid to feel it. Because you know who you are beneath the pain, and that changes everything. You might be wondering, how do I actually begin to integrate the parts of myself I've spent years trying to forget? It starts with awareness, but not just intellectual awareness, emotional awareness, nervous system awareness. The kind of awareness that doesn't just recognize a wound, but feels it, without trying to fix it, justify it, or escape it. You have to become the witness, not the judge, the witness. Because the moment you stop fighting what you feel and start listening to it instead, your unconscious begins to open. It starts to reveal the hidden architecture of your emotional life. All the blueprints that were drawn when you were still too young to even hold a pencil. The moment you were told to be quiet. The moment your tears were met with punishment instead of comfort. The moment your emotional needs were treated like burden. Those blueprints become beliefs. Beliefs like, I'm too much, or I have to be strong, or I won't be loved. And here you are, still building your entire life around structures that were formed in moments of emotional abandonment. But you can rebuild, not by erasing the past, but by re-encountering it with new eyes, with compassion, with presence. Carl Jung didn't believe in perfection. He didn't believe healing was about becoming flawless. He believed it was about becoming whole. That's why he said, I'd rather be whole than good. Because chasing the idea of being good enough, kind enough, patient enough, is often just another mask, a way of controlling how others see you, so they don't touch the parts of you you're ashamed of. But wholeness doesn't require performance. It requires truth. And truth, by its very nature, is uncomfortable. It demands that you sit with the parts of yourself you've tried to negotiate out of existence, the rage you were told to suppress, the fear you were told to hide, the longing you were told to feel embarrassed by. But when you welcome those parts home, not just mentally but emotionally, you stop being controlled by them. The anger becomes boundary, the fear becomes intuition, the longing becomes sacred desire. That is how you transmute pain into power. Now let's be honest, this isn't easy. In fact, most people avoid this work their entire lives. They build relationships on false versions of themselves. They seek validation instead of connection. They confuse performance with love. And they wonder why they feel so empty, so unseen, so misunderstood. But the truth is, no one can truly love you if they don't truly know you. And no one can truly know you until you do. The deeper you go into yourself, the more you begin to see the people you chased, the relationships you tolerated, the silence you accepted, They were never about them. They were about the parts of you that still believed you had to earn love through suffering, that you had to prove your worth by being unbreakable, that if you were just good enough, no one would ever leave. But those are the illusions of a wounded self, and when you stop believing them, when you stop rehearsing that trauma script every time you feel pain, you begin to reclaim something far more important than approval: your autonomy, your emotional sovereignty. You stop giving people the remote control to your nervous system. You stop outsourcing your peace to people who don't even know how to hold their own. You stop seeing rejection as a verdict and start seeing it as redirection. You stop seeing abandonment as a failure and start seeing it as liberation from places that never honored your depth to begin with. This is what Carl Jung meant when he spoke about the power of the unconscious. He knew that as long as your shadow, the rejected, suppressed and forgotten parts of you, remained hidden, it would continue to direct your life from the dark. And you would keep calling it bad luck, or destiny, or just the way things are. But when you bring it into the light, when you integrate it, you begin to choose instead of react. You begin to respond from clarity instead of protect from fear. You begin to see that everything you thought was a curse, the intensity, the overthinking, the emotional depth, was actually your gift all along. It just needed guidance, presence, compassion. And now it needs you. Because here's the most painful and beautiful truth. No one is coming to rescue you, but also no one needs to. Because you are not broken, you are not missing pieces, you are simply disconnected from them. And shadow work, the process Jung championed, is how you reconnect. It's how you come back into contact with the parts of you that you exiled in order to survive. The sensitive child, the bold dreamer, the angry protector, the sacred self that still remembers who you were before the world told you to dim it down. And when you reconnect with those pieces, when you choose to integrate instead of hide, the world changes. Not because the world itself is different, but because you are. Suddenly the words that once pierced you lose their power. The silence that once haunted you becomes a sanctuary. The loss that once shattered you becomes a teacher. That's not just healing, that's transformation. And that is the real work. The work that can't be done through pretending, the work that requires you to stand naked in your own truth, messy, complicated, and free. So if you want to become someone who is no longer hurt by everything and everyone, stop asking how to protect yourself from pain. Start asking what that pain is trying to reveal. Start asking what part of you still believes it deserves to suffer. Because the moment you stop blaming others for your triggers, you begin to master your emotional landscape. And when you do that, nothing and nobody can hurt you the way they once did. Not because the world is suddenly safe, but because you have become the one who knows how to hold yourself through the storm. You have become the one who no longer abandons yourself when it hurts. The one who meets pain with presence. The one who no longer needs to be unbreakable. Because you are unshakably real. So how does it actually happen, this shift from being hurt over and over to becoming someone who feels untouchable? Not in the way that makes you disconnected or guarded, but in the way that makes you fully alive, open-hearted, anchored, unshakable. It starts when you stop identifying with the wound and start becoming the one who witnesses it. Most people live trapped in reaction. Something happens, a rejection, a silence, a look, and instantly the nervous system flares, anxiety floods in, the mind starts spinning. What did I do wrong? Why don't they care? What's wrong with me? But the moment you catch that spiral, the moment you step outside the story, everything begins to change, because now you're no longer the child reacting, you're the adult observing, and in that shift, you take your power back. You become the container, not the chaos. You become the conscious presence that can hold the younger part of you with compassion instead of trying to fix her with shame. Jung believed that every neurosis, every repeated emotional suffering is a cry from the unconscious asking to be met, not silenced. But the modern world doesn't teach you to meet your wounds. It teaches you to hide them, perform over them, post inspirational quotes over them, hustle until you forget they exist. But the wound doesn't forget. It waits. It waits for quiet moments, late-night conversations, the look in someone's eyes that brings it all rushing back. And you think, why am I still like this? But the question isn't, why are you still like this? The question is, have you ever really been allowed to feel this without being punished, abandoned, or shamed? Because until you have, the pain will repeat. Not because you're broken, but because your inner world is asking to be seen, not solved. You're not here to be perfect. You're here to be real. And the truth is, your emotional wounds are not signs of weakness. They're proof that you have survived what was once unbearable. But you were never meant to live in survival mode forever. You were meant to evolve, to move from reflex to reflection, from defense to depth, from fear to freedom. And the bridge between those two realities is you. Not a better version of you, not a more successful or more attractive or more confident you, just a more honest you, a more integrated you. Because the truth is, confidence doesn't come from achievement. It comes from self-intimacy, from knowing exactly who you are, flaws, fears, fire and all, and refusing to abandon yourself ever again. That's the work that changes everything. Because once you stop abandoning yourself, others lose the power to do it for you. You stop making room for half-love. You stop settling for crumbs. You stop explaining your worth to people who only ever wanted a muted version of you. That's what individuation really is. The process Jung said was the goal of the human psyche, to become whole, to become who you really are beneath the masks, beyond the roles, outside the trauma. And yet this wholeness isn't about becoming better. It's about remembering what was always true, that you were never meant to be small, that your sensitivity was never a flaw, that your boundaries were never too much, that your intuition was never wrong. Somewhere along the way, someone convinced you that your pain made you unworthy, but your pain doesn't make you unworthy, it makes you aware. Aware of what's not working, aware of what's missing, aware of what your soul is still waiting for. And maybe that's why it hurts so much, because your soul remembers a version of life that you haven't fully stepped into yet, a version where you are allowed to take up space, allowed to be messy and magical, allowed to walk away from anything that asks you to betray yourself. That version of you isn't a fantasy, it's a future that becomes possible the moment you stop waiting to be rescued and start choosing to return to yourself. But you have to be brave, because when you choose to heal, you don't just lose pain, you lose identities, you lose stories, you lose relationships that were built on who you pretended to be. And that's terrifying. But it's also sacred, because in that shedding you find something more valuable than comfort. You find truth, and in truth, you find peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from everything being easy, the kind that comes from knowing that whatever happens, you've got you. And when you've got you, you stop walking on eggshells. You stop shrinking to fit into other people's expectations. You stop performing emotional labor for people who refuse to meet you halfway. That's not selfish, that's self-honoring. And the more you honor yourself, the more the world begins to reflect that back to you. Not perfectly, not always gently, but clearly, energetically, unmistakably. Carl Jung once said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And he was right, because accepting yourself completely means welcoming not just your light, but your shadow. The jealousy, the insecurity, the desire to be seen, the fear of being forgotten, the parts of you you swore you'd outgrow. But healing doesn't mean outgrowing those parts. It means outgrowing the shame you've attached to them. It means realizing those emotions don't make you unworthy. They make you human. And being human means being complex, contradictory, alive. You don't have to become flawless to become free. You just have to become faithful to yourself, to your boundaries, to your truth, to the parts of you that are still learning how to trust that it's safe to exist without apology. So the next time you feel that familiar sting, that sense of being hurt, ignored, unseen, ask yourself, am I being hurt by them or by the story I'm still carrying? Am I responding from my truth or reacting from my wound? That question alone can change everything, because the moment you see your trigger not as an attack but as an invitation, you shift from victim to creator, from child to conscious adult, from fractured to whole. And the more you choose wholeness, even when it's hard, even when it's lonely, the more powerful you become, not in the way that dominates, in the way that liberates. Because when you are no longer ruled by the fear of being hurt, you are free. There's a quiet kind of strength that starts to emerge when you stop living in reaction to your pain. It doesn't come with applause. It doesn't come with a badge of honor. It comes in the way you breathe differently when you're alone, in the way you stop explaining yourself to people who've already decided who you are, in the way you stop trying to convince anyone of your worth. That's the strength that grows when you've faced yourself in the dark and chosen not to abandon what you found there. That's the strength that emerges when your inner child knows, really knows, that you won't leave them again just because someone else does. And when that happens, the whole emotional game changes. Suddenly, the people who once had the power to break you feel smaller, not because they've changed, but because you've stopped giving them access to the part of you that was still bleeding. Because here's the truth. Most people aren't hurting you. They're just reflecting back the parts of you that haven't healed. That's why someone's silence can feel louder than a scream. That's why someone's dismissal can sting more than a punch. Because it's not just about them. It's about what their behavior touches inside you. But when you've done the work, when you've sat with that pain, cried with it, breathed through it, seen it not as a weakness but as a sacred teacher, you're no longer vulnerable in the same way. You can still feel, you can still hurt, but you're not lost in it. You're not shattered by it. You're not defined by it. You become the one who observes it, tends to it, and moves forward with deeper clarity than ever before. That's what Carl Jung meant when he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Fate isn't some mystical force deciding who will love you and who will hurt you. Fate is the sum of the unconscious patterns you haven't yet brought into the light. It's the way your wounds choose your partners, the way your fear picks your job, the way your shame writes your story without asking your permission. But when you do the work, when you bring those patterns into awareness, you become the author. You become the one who says, not this time, not this kind of love, not this version of me. And that choice, repeated over and over, becomes your freedom. But you have to be patient, because real transformation doesn't happen in a breakthrough moment. It happens in the 1,000 tiny decisions you make when no one's watching. The decision to not text them back, the decision to take a breath before reacting, the decision to speak up even when your voice shakes, the decision to walk away from chaos even when your body still craves the drama it was raised on. That's the real alchemy. That's how you build the version of you that no longer flinches at abandonment, no longer breaks from rejection, no longer tries to rescue people at the cost of your own soul. You stop trying to be chosen, and you choose yourself, not as a performance, but as a devotion. And let's be clear, that's going to cost you something. You might lose friends, you might outgrow relationships, you might watch people distance themselves from your clarity, not because you've become difficult, but because you've become sovereign. And people who benefit from your self-abandonment will always feel threatened by your wholeness. But that's not your burden to carry. You weren't born to be understood by everyone. You weren't born to keep the peace at the expense of your truth. You were born to become, to evolve, to remember, to return to the unshakable truth of who you are, beneath all the conditioning, beneath all the roles, beneath all the wounds that once convinced you that love must be earned through suffering. You were never meant to be everyone's emotional caretaker. You were never meant to shrink so others could feel more comfortable. You were never meant to edit yourself to survive. You were meant to integrate, to bring your inner world into alignment with your outer world, so that what you feel, what you say, and what you choose are finally in harmony. That's the essence of individuation. That's the path Jung laid out. Not a path to perfection, but a path to authenticity. And that kind of authenticity makes you emotionally untouchable, not because you never get hurt, but because you know what to do with your hurt. You stop projecting it. You stop bleeding on people who didn't cut you. You stop pretending you're okay just to keep someone else comfortable. Instead, you become the one who says, "This pain is mine, and I will face it with love." You become the one who no longer needs revenge or validation or closure from the ones who couldn't love you. You become the one who knows how to close your own wounds, not with denial, but with sacred attention. And over time you realize the wound never needed fixing, it just needed you, your presence, your compassion, your courage to not look away. Because when you stop looking away, you start to see clearly. You start to see who is safe and who is not. You start to see what patterns no longer serve you. You start to see that the old version of you, the one who was desperate to be loved, was doing the best they could. And you loved them, not with shame, but with pride. Because they got you here. They kept you alive. But now, it's time for something more. Now it's time to not just survive, but to live. Fully, freely, fiercely. And when you do, when you live from that place, nothing and nobody will ever hurt you the same way again. Not because life stops being hard, but because you stop being afraid of your own depth. You stop fearing your own intensity. You stop betraying your own voice. And that kind of self-loyalty, that's unbreakable. The real turning point in your healing doesn't come when someone apologizes. It doesn't come when life finally gives you everything you once begged for. It comes in the moment you realize you're no longer waiting. You're no longer trying to be seen by people who never learned how to look. You're no longer bending yourself into shapes just to avoid abandonment. You're no longer explaining emotions to people committed to misunderstanding you. You're no longer shrinking, hiding, apologizing for your fire. That moment, quiet as it may be, is the beginning of emotional sovereignty. And from that moment on, your life will never be the same. Because once you realize your safety comes from within, the world loses its power to wound you in the same old ways. Disapproval doesn't shake you. Rejection doesn't define you. Loneliness doesn't scare you, because you've walked through your own darkness and found a home there. You've stopped outsourcing your worth. You've stopped performing for affection. You've stopped making pain your identity. Instead, you've made it your initiation, your rite of passage, your sacred return. Carl Jung called this the path of the wounded healer, the one who turns inward not to escape the world, but to understand it from the inside out, the one who learns to hold pain without collapsing under it, the one who alchemizes their suffering into wisdom. And maybe that's who you are becoming. Not someone without scars, but someone who carries them with reverence. Not someone who's above feeling, but someone who feels without drowning. Not someone who seeks control, but someone who trusts their own inner compass, no matter how chaotic the outer world becomes. You don't get there by bypassing your pain. You don't get there by pretending you're healed when you're still bleeding. You get there by walking through the fire and realizing it cannot burn what is real, only what is false, only the masks, the roles, the stories that were never yours to begin with. And when those things fall away, what's left? You, the real you, the one you were always meant to be, before the trauma, before the fear, before the world told you that who you are was too much, too intense, too sensitive, too complicated. You are not too much. You were never too much. You were just around people who were not ready for your depth. But that doesn't mean you need to become less. It means you need to find places, relationships, and spaces where your depth is recognized as a gift, not a problem to be solved. And to do that, you must first offer that recognition to yourself, because the people who will honor your full self can only find you once you have found you, not the curated version, not the edited highlight reel, the whole you. The you that feels deeply, thinks intensely, and sees through masks. The you who knows when a smile is fake, when a compliment is a manipulation, when silence is louder than words. That's your power. And once you stop denying it, once you stop hiding it to keep others comfortable, you become unstoppable, not invincible, but grounded. Rooted, lit from within. And that light, it might scare some. It might threaten the people who were used to your silence, your self-abandonment, your over-explaining, but let them be scared. Let them go. Because anyone who asks you to dim yourself was never safe to begin with, and you are no longer available for unsafe people. You are no longer participating in your own wounding. You are no longer giving access to people who haven't earned your energy. That's not bitterness, that's maturity, that's clarity. That's the quiet realization that you no longer need to bleed just to prove you care, that you can be loving and still say no, that you can be kind and still walk away, that you can be understanding without tolerating the intolerable. That's the strength that comes from integration. The strength of someone who has stopped running from themselves and started standing in themselves, fully, fiercely, unapologetically. So now you're here, not healed, not perfect, but awake to the truth that nothing and nobody can hurt you the way they once did, because you've remembered who you are, because you've called your power back, because you've made a sacred vow to never again betray yourself just to feel safe. And that vow changes everything. It changes how you walk into rooms, it changes how you love, it changes how you grieve, it changes how you let go. Because now, even when it hurts, you stay with yourself. You breathe, you feel, you witness, you don't run, you don't numb, you don't collapse. You meet the pain, you hold it, and then you rise. Maybe not all at once, maybe not dramatically, but steadily, truly, powerfully, because you've remembered something essential, something Jung spent his life trying to help people see. You were never broken, you were just waiting to come home to yourself. And now, you're home.